August 27, 1944. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Harold Morgan stood alone behind a 50mm anti-tank gun, its barrel turned in what everyone said was the wrong direction. It wasn't aimed at the road, where, according to the map, the danger was supposed to come from, but at the dark line of trees behind them, the same forest every officer insisted was impassable for tanks. Behind him, the rest of the platoon slept in their foxholes or leaned against tree trunks with rifles across their laps and nerves gone slack. They thought this sector was calm. They thought he was paranoid. Just a few hours earlier, they had laughed when he turned the gun around. Actually laughed. One of them said, "Morgan, you planning to shoot squirrels or Nazis? 'Cause the front's that way." Harold said nothing. He just kept digging. He'd removed the locking pin himself and spent the second half of the day realigning the gun's carriage with 2 privates and a crowbar. No orders, no permission. Just instinct and a bad feeling deep in his gut. Now, standing alone in the dark, he felt it. A faint vibration beneath his boots, like the slow breath of something enormous rising from underground. He crouched, pressed his eye to the sight, and narrowed his gaze. And then he saw it. No lights, no roaring engines. Just a wide, flat silhouette sliding between the trees like a shadow. A German Panzer. Not one, 6 of them, emerging from the forest behind the line, like wolves slipping through a back door. Harold heard nothing but the wind and the grind of treads sinking into soft earth. Yet no one else moved. No one else saw. He swallowed, took a breath, and whispered under his breath, "You all laughed at this damn gun." He reached for the trigger handle. "Let's see who's laughing now." He pulled. The night exploded in fire. A farm boy who didn't believe in maps, until fire lit up a Belgian forest. Just a kid from Bozeman, Montana, with a father who never trusted plans drawn by men in warm offices. Harold Morgan was born in 1920. The son of a World War I veteran and a schoolteacher. He grew up surrounded by wheat fields, tractor parts, and the cutting wind that came down from the Rockies. By nature, he wasn't a soldier. By instinct, he was a mechanic. By 14, he had disassembled and rebuilt a Ford engine in the family barn just to see if he could make it run quieter. His father never spoke much about the war, but one thing he repeated often: "Don't trust a map if the road's gone. Make your own." Hal took that to heart. He trusted what he could see, touch, and feel, not what someone else drew on paper. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Hal didn't hesitate. He enlisted within 72 hours, determined not to fight from a desk or at a safe distance. "I wanted the front line, and I got it." Assigned to an anti-tank unit of the U.S. Army, Hal joined the 101st Airborne Division. Some called it elite. Hal didn't care about labels. "I liked the equipment. I liked the challenge. But most of all, I liked the idea of being the one who stopped the metal monsters, the machines rolling across Europe, crushing cities and bones alike." To Hal, tanks weren't invincible. They were puzzles, and he liked solving puzzles. By the summer of 1944, he had marched with the division through Normandy, past the living and the ruins alike, France and up to the borders of Belgium. I had seen what a German tank could do to an ill-placed foxhole. I had seen men vanish into the fog from high-explosive shells. And most importantly, I had learned this: the front is not always in front. So when my unit was ordered to hold Hill 312, a small rise by the Meuse River north of the dense HOV forest, Hal looked at the map, then at the trees behind us, and felt something was wrong. Everyone else pointed their guns toward the open road. Hal turned and stared into the woods. I didn't yet know it, but I was on the verge of the most important decision of my life. The hill that could not be held. On paper, it looked perfect. Hill 312, just an unnamed knoll on the edge of a quiet road in southern Belgium. From it you dominated the valley floor and the narrow stone track that bent toward Liège, the route the Germans had used for years to move fuel and armor east. When Hell's unit received orders to hold it, the mood was almost carefree. The tide of war had turned. Paris was liberated. The Germans were retreating. Everyone expected a direct push into the Ruhr. The ground was considered safe, but Hell didn't believe it. I saw what others did not. A wide open field lay before the hill. That was where they pointed the gun. That was where the engineers planted mines. That was where the officers paced back and forth with binoculars and cigarettes, feeling confident. But behind us was something entirely different. Thick trees, tangled undergrowth, and deeper within a faint track, worn by logging wagons decades before. It didn't even appear on the map, but Hal noticed it on the first day. I crouched at the edge, peered into that belt of trees, and pictured it in the light of fire. "You could bring an entire tank platoon down there," I muttered. His sergeant, Andy Lewis, snorted when Hal mentioned it. "Only if they grow wings. This forest's a dead end." Others joined in with their teasing. "Relax, Morgan. If the Frits show up behind us, I'll buy you a steak, or better yet, give you my chevrons." Hal didn't laugh. I'd read enough German field reports to know the desperate positions panzer commanders could find themselves in. I knew how they used deception, night movements, and unmarked trails, anything to swing around and outflank. So Hal asked again, "Can we turn one gun around?" "One gun. I'll dig the position myself." Sergeant Lewis slapped him on the shoulder. "We're low on ammo and have a 200-degree arc of threat ahead of us. Focus on that." So Hal focused, only not in the way they expected. That night after supper I waited for the stars. Then I took a crowbar, a shovel, and that bad premonition and got to work. The gun that shouldn't have been turned. The 50mm M1 anti-tank gun was never meant to be rotated 180 degrees. It was a frontal action weapon, built to be aim-placed, hold the line, and rain hell on whatever came in at 12 o'clock. This firing arc was limited. Its wheels were for transport, not for battlefield maneuvering. If you wanted to face another way, you were supposed to dig an entirely new emplacement. That's what the manual said. That's what the officers believed. But Harold Morgan had never cared much for what people said couldn't be done. So just after sunset, while most of the unit cleaned boots, wrote letters, or dozed in their foxholes, Hal set to work. I had no permission, no support, no cover, only a crowbar. 2 pairs of stubborn hands. Bricks and Carter, 2 green kids from Ohio and Arkansas who decided Hal might be onto something, and a patch of ground wide enough to hide the heresy. First we removed the front stops. Then we dug a new gun pit 2 meters behind the current position, large enough, deep enough for the recoil to go somewhere other than straight back into their lungs. Hal measured every angle himself, checked the lines of fire, and used a rusty carpenter's level from his pack, because in war, a single air bubble could mean life or death. Then came the dangerous part, unlocking the trails and moving the wheels. The M1 gun wasn't heavy by tank standards, but it wasn't light either, about 3,000 pounds of raw steel, slick with oil and sweat. The 3 of them used a rope, a broken axle, and half a tree stump to turn it, like some cursed carousel. Took over an hour. Bricks slipped and split his knuckles open on the sight rail. Carter swore under his breath. At one point, the entire carriage nearly tipped backward. Hal didn't say a word. When the barrel finally pointed into the forest, past the map, against every field regulation written since 1942, Hal stepped back and looked at his work. The line of sight was narrow. The gun couldn't swing much left or right. But it didn't need to. It was aimed at a corridor, a funnel of trees that Hal believed might one day bring death. Now it would bring something else. "You're insane," Carter muttered, wiping his hands. Hal just looked up at the moon. Better insane than dead. By midnight it was done. The gun stood silent, hidden behind brush, loaded with a single armor-piercing shell. They buried the wheels in soil, camouflaged the frame, and hid their tools. No one noticed, or so they thought. The next morning, Sergeant Lewis walked by, stopped, and raised an eyebrow. Looks like someone's doing unauthorized landscaping. Halsruged. Ground was uneven. Didn't want the recoil knocking us over. Lewis smirked, but his tone hardened. Morgan, don't get clever. You know the order, guns face forward. The war's that way. Hal said nothing. Lewis waited, then moved on. That day the platoon drilled their firing positions, practiced elevation angles, drank weak coffee, and talked about how close they were to Berlin. Hal stayed quiet. I kept running through firing procedures in my head, one eye always on that tree line. That night, I returned alone to the turned gun, checked the breech, oiled the loading mechanism, ran my palm along the barrel like a farmer soothing a nervous horse. The forest was quiet, but too quiet. No birds, no crickets, only the wind through old trees. I lit a cigarette not to smoke, but to see how the flame flickered. Barely moved. Dead air. Thick silence. As if the whole forest was holding its breath. I whispered to myself, if they come, they'll come from behind. I leaned down, slid one shell into the breech, locked it with a click, and sat to wait. Then the ground began to tremble. August 27th, 1944. Hill 312 had been silent for 3 days. Too silent. The usual forest sounds had faded. No birds, no insects, no rustling. Only that uneasy hush that settles over the woods when something big is about to pass through. Hal Morgan felt it before he heard it. I was kneeling beside my turned gun, eating cold beans from a tin, when I noticed the ground shifting under my boots. At first, it was faint, a heartbeat under the soil. Then it grew steady, rhythmic, deliberate. I set the can aside, wiped my hands, knelt, and pressed my fingers to the dirt. There it was again. Not thunder, not wind. Tracks, heavy tracks. Slowly, I rose and looked through the gun's sight at the tree line. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then something moved. A shape, at first just a shadow. No headlights. No roaring engines. Only the low scrape of steel treads pushing through wet leaves. And then, in a gap between the trees, I saw it clearly. Panzer IV, low and wide, draped in branches for camouflage, gliding forward like a predator. The short gun pointed dead ahead. The hatches sealed. The turret turning, slow and deliberate. Hal estroatigtanet. I wasn't paranoid. I was right. Bricks? I whispered loud enough for the nearby trench to hear. Get over here. Now. Private Bricks ran up, still buttoning his jacket. What's going on? Hal didn't answer, he just pointed. Bricks looked through the sight and went pale. Jesus Christ. The Panzer crept closer, unaware it was being watched. Behind it came another, then another, 6 in total, moving in single file with deliberate silence. Engines muffled. A textbook ambush. They were using the old logging trail, the one missing from the maps, just as Hal had feared. Go get Carter, Hal muttered. Now. Bricks ran off. Hal stayed, eyes locked to the scope. The tanks were about 200 yards out. No infantry, no sound, just shadows and steel. Hal's hand hovered over the trigger. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the trembling ground. This is it. No more maps. No more orders. No more laughter. Just Hal, a gun, and 6 Panzers coming straight through the back door. Carter arrived, rubbing sleep from his eyes. What, we waking the whole forest up? Hal just pointed. Carter's jaw dropped. They're behind us. Hal nodded once. Exactly where they weren't supposed to be. They watched for another minute, maybe two. Time felt elastic, stretched thin, surreal. The lead tank slowed, nearing the slope. Another 30 feet and it would have a clear shot at the command post behind them. Every other gun, all facing forward, would be useless. Hal turned to Carter and Bricks. Load armor-piercing. Fast. We get one shot. Bricks hesitated. Shouldn't we report it first? Hal didn't blink. If we wait, they'll be on top of us. I'm not asking. Carter yanked a shell from the crate. Cold, heavy, painted dull gray with a yellow stripe. 57 millimeters of pure Defiance. He rammed it into the breech. It locked with a clean metallic click. Hal adjusted the sight, fine-tuned elevation, took one steady breath. Then came the moment of decision. His hands were steady. His heart was not. For the record, I said quietly, this was a terrible idea. Bricks laughed nervously. Carter just stared. Hal's finger tightened on the trigger. I inhaled, held it, waited. The nose of the Panzer crossed the treeline, and Hal pulled. The gun spoke. The trigger snapped with a metallic crack. Half a second later, the earth convulsed. The recoil slammed into Hal's shoulder like a car crash. The 50-millimeter armor-piercing round screamed forward, cutting through fog, trees, and decades of military doctrine. It struck the Panzer just beneath the turret ring, right in the rear engine compartment, the weakest spot on a German tank. At first, no explosion, just a dull thud, like a fist against a steel drum. Then smoke, thick, black, and oily, rising in a vertical column, as if the tank itself exhaled death. The turret jerked sideways, then the whole machine caught fire. Not orange flame, blue. The kind that means fuel, oil, metal. Everything burning at once. Inside, the German crew had no time to react. One hatch burst open, and a figure half emerged before collapsing back into the inferno. Bricks staggered backward, mouth open. You hit it. Hal didn't answer. I was already slamming the second shell in. Carter, next one now. The second tank hesitated, unsure whether what just happened was an accident or an ambush. Its turret began to turn, left, then right, but too late. Hal nudged the barrel slightly. The elevation was perfect. I fired again. This time the shell struck where the hull met the left track. Sparks exploded as the tread snapped, curling like a dead serpent. The Panzer lurched sideways, momentum carrying it into a tree trunk where it jammed, crippled, blind, trapped in a cage of bark. Inside, the crew scrambled to escape. Hal reached for the third round. Bricks, faster. We've never fired this much in training. This isn't training. The third tank had now stopped completely. Its commander must have seen the flames ahead and realized the entire column was in the kill zone. He shouted orders. The vehicle began backing up slowly. German tanks were never known for their agility in reverse. Hal gritted his teeth. Give me one more. But before I could fire, a sound tore through the trees from the opposite direction. American artillery, from the front side of the hill, where the rest of the platoon's guns were aimed, came the thunder of 105mm howitzers opening up. The noise was deafening, echoing through the forest like a god clearing his throat. Shells began landing around the retreating tanks, trapping them between hammer and anvil. The Germans were caught, and there was no way out. The 4th Panzer, trying to swing around, took a direct hit from a howitzer. It vanished in a fountain of flame and earth. The 5th was put out of action by shrapnel. This crew abandoned the vehicle and fled into the trees, only to meet American rifle fire. The 6th and last tank roared its engine and tried to burst back down the track. It made 100 yards before Hal's gun found it. The last shot pierced the side armor clean through. This time there was no delay. The tank blew up like a ruptured boiler. The blast lifted its chassis 3 feet off the ground. When the dust settled, all 6 German tanks were either destroyed or abandoned, and not one round had been fired from the American guns facing forward. The battlefield fell silent. Only smoke, fire, and the distant sound of someone coughing through soot. Hal stepped away from the gun. His hands shook, not from fatigue but from adrenaline. I didn't speak or smile. I just stared at the barrel, still hot and still smoking, and muttered, "That's why you turn this damn gun." Carter leaned against a tree white as chalk. "I thought you were crazy." "I am," Hal said, "but better crazy than dead." The rest of the platoon regrouped behind them in a hurry. Too late. The danger had already passed. The ambush had failed, because one gun wasn't pointed the same way as the others, depending on who you asked. An officer ran up, eyes wide, scanning the smoking wreckage. "Who fired first?" Bricks pointed at him. The officer looked at Hal, standing with hands black from powder and oil, sleeves torn, face slick with sweat and smoke. "You? How did you know they'd come from behind?" the officer asked. Hal didn't answer. He went back to his foxhole, sat down, and opened the same cold tin of beans he'd dropped 30 minutes earlier. This time he ate in silence. The fires burned for hours, even after the last shell detonated and the last tank stopped twitching. Hill 312 remained shrouded in thick, bitter smoke and a strange quiet. It was not the silence of triumph. It was the silence of being stunned. Harold Morgan sat beside his gun with his legs out, his uniform scorched, hands black with soot. "I fired 4 shots, hit 4 targets. 3 of them burned just beyond the tree line. One split open like a tin can. Its track was thrown 30 feet into the woods. I didn't move for 15 minutes. Not because I was exhausted, not because I was wounded, but because I didn't want to hear it." Footsteps approached anyway. Sergeant Andy Lewis, helmetless, sweat running down his face, dirt in every crease of his uniform. Looked like a man who just walked out of a burning cathedral. He stopped 2 feet from Hal and cleared his throat. "So that's what just happened." Hal didn't lift his eyes. "I kept watching the woods, still scanning, still expecting another shadow to move." Came the answer. A long pause followed. Then Lewis said something Hal hadn't expected. "I was wrong." Hal turned. "About what?" "About you. About this. About all of it." He pointed at the wreckage. "I reported to command that the woods were safe. I told them tanks couldn't get through. I told you to keep the guns facing forward. If you hadn't disobeyed me, we'd be dead right now." Hal blinked. "So where's that stake?" Lewis almost laughed. Almost. Instead he stepped forward and stuck out his hand. "Thank you, Morgan. You saved a lot of lives tonight." Hal gave a short, firm handshake and let go. Around them, other soldiers slowly realized what had happened. One by one, the men who had laughed at the idea of a turned gun now stood and looked at him like a saint. Bricks came up and slapped Hal on the shoulder. "Man, you shot a Panzer in the ass. That's a medal." Carter nodded. "They should rename the hill after you." But Hal only shook his head. "Call it what you want. Just remember this." Stood up, picked up the spent shell casing from the last shot, still warm to the touch, and held it in his hand as if it were made of glass. The front isn't always in front. Later that morning, at 0700, a report was filed to battalion headquarters. Subject: Defensive actions on Hill 312. Time: 2300 to 2345, August 27th. Unit: 3rd Platoon, Company C, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Summary: 1 anti-tank gun was repositioned without official order, engaged the enemy, and destroyed 4 Panzer IV tanks in a defensive action to the rear. Enemy losses estimated at 32 killed. No American casualties. At the bottom of the report was a single line. Gun repositioned by Private First Class Harold Morgan on his own initiative. But when the divisional command read it 2 days later, they thought it was a typo. You mean he turned the entire gun around, without orders? The company clerk shrugged. That's what it says. They laughed. Then they read it again, and stopped laughing. Word of Hal's actions spread quickly through the regiment. Some called it luck, others genius. One lieutenant called it reckless brilliance, the kind that usually got a man either killed or promoted. But Hal wanted neither. That same day, he refused an immediate nomination for the Bronze Star. When the clerk brought the papers, Hal handed them back unread. "Give it to Bricks and Carter," I said. "They did the digging." The clerk blinked. "But you fired the shots." Hal only shrugged. The gun fired back. "We're even." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Bodies were recovered. Wrecks were mapped. Engineers arrived to haul away the shattered Panzers. They said they'd rarely seen so many tanks knocked out in such tight proximity, especially by a 50mm gun. One captain stood by the repositioned weapon for nearly 10 minutes, just staring down the line of fire. "This makes no sense," he muttered. But it did. To Hal, it made perfect sense, because maps are drawn by men who weren't there, and wars are decided by those who are. The mechanic who walked away. Harold Morgan never told his story to newspapers. He never gave interviews, never wrote memoirs, never once used the word hero. He simply went home. In April 1946, 6 months after the official end of the war, Hal stepped off a train platform in Bozeman, Montana, carrying one duffel bag and a discharge folder. His uniform still fit. His hair was shorter, his eyes calmer. I walked straight from the station to my father's garage, just 3 blocks off Main Street. The sign still hung above the door. Morgan and Son, engines for anything that moves. By the end of the week, I was back under the hood of a tractor. People in town knew I'd been overseas, knew I'd fought somewhere in Belgium. But Hal never talked about it. Not because he was haunted by ghosts, but because the war itself wasn't what mattered to him. What came after did. Whenever someone tried to thank him for his service, Hal changed the subject. Once, when a neighbor asked if he'd done anything important over there, Hal paused, wiped his hands with a rag and said, "I turned a gun the wrong way, and it worked out. That was it." But it wasn't all of it. Deep down, Hal knew that. He just didn't believe courage needed an audience. For the next 30 years, Hal lived what most would call a quiet life. He married a librarian, built a modest house outside town, and fixed engines for farmers who couldn't afford to replace them. He never took a dime, never took money from a widow or a veteran. Every summer, I led high schoolers on hiking trips through the Absarka Mountains, teaching them to navigate by instinct, not just by compass. If your gut screams, stop, but the map says go, I told them, you stop, you look again, then you decide. I wasn't preaching. I was passing on the lesson that once saved my life and the lives of dozens of others. The only reminder of the war in his house sat on a shelf above his workbench. A cracked shell casing, scorched and dented, its serial number barely visible. He never told guests what it was, but he never put it away either. And once a year, always on the same evening at the end of August, Hal would sit on the back porch, look out at the trees behind his home, and let the silence speak. "I never called it an anniversary," he said. But that's what it was. In 1985, a local history teacher tracked Hal down. He had come across a declassified battalion report from the war, the one about Hill 312, and noticed a footnote. Gun repositioned against protocol by PFC Harold Morgan. Result: For enemy tanks destroyed, 0 friendly casualties. The teacher asked if he could bring a group of student journalists for an interview. How ditchly Ned. But a week later, the teacher received a letter in the mail. Inside was a single handwritten page, no signature, no return address. It read, "I didn't turn the gun to be brave. I turned it because I saw what no one else saw. I trusted my eyes, my gut, and a small stretch of bad road that no one thought mattered. If that's a story worth telling, then tell it. But don't tell it about a man. Tell it about a choice." Today, that letter is displayed in the Montana Veterans Museum, framed beside a replica 50mm shell. Each spring, teachers show it to their students not to teach them how to fight, but to teach them how to think. What Harold Morgan did on that hill in Belgium was more than a tactical decision. It was an act of independent judgment, of moral clarity, of creative disobedience, in a world obsessed with orders and standard procedures. He challenged the idea that doing what you're told is always the safest thing. He proved that sometimes the only way forward is to turn around. And above all, he showed that heroism doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with dirt under your nails and a shell casing in your pocket. If you ask the men who survived that night, those who saw the burning tanks behind them, they'll tell you the truth. He didn't just save us. He rewrote what it means to lead from below. They laughed when he turned that gun. And for a long time, maybe even Harold Morgan himself wasn't sure they were wrong to laugh. Because turning a gun the wrong way isn't just a mechanical decision. It's a moral one. It says, I don't trust the path everyone else is on. I see a threat no one else wants to admit. And I'm willing to stand in that silence alone, until it speaks. That night in Belgium, Hal's gun was aimed into the unknown, and the unknown answered with fire, truth, and survival. There are thousands of stories from World War II. Tales of courage, strategy, sacrifice. Most of them are loud. Some are famous. But Harold Morgan's story is quiet. It lives in the margins between official orders and unspoken instincts that save lives. It reminds us that not every act of leadership comes from above. Sometimes the one who breaks the rule saves the rulebook. It reminds us that thinking for yourself isn't rebellion. Sometimes it's responsibility. And it reminds us that a map is only as good as the courage of the man reading it. So here's my question to you. Have you ever seen danger coming from a direction no one else was looking? And when that moment came, did you turn?